Today, Joe Biden welcomes Donald Trump back to the White House, holding substantive talks in the Oval Office.
I appreciate very much a transition that's so smooth. It'll be as smooth as it can get.
As the president-elect nominates Republican firebrand Matt Gaetz for Attorney General and Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. Australian Airlines resumed flights in and out of Bali after volcanic ash caused cancellations. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese touches down in Peru for trade talks, with Donald Trump's tariff plans looming over the meeting. The federal government to try and force social media giants to take preventative action to limit harm to users. And an enormous ocean discovery. Marine scientists say they've found the world's largest coral in Solomon Islands. Hello, I'm Dan Borscher. This is ABC News coming to you from the lands of the Cadigal people. US President-elect Donald Trump has made his first return to the White House since leaving office, meeting with President Joe Biden to discuss the transition of power. The former president continued to announce his cabinet picks after the visit. He's nominated Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz as his Attorney General. Gaetz, who worked briefly as a lawyer before entering politics, is notable for his strident loyalty to Mr. Trump. The former president has also announced 2016 rival Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State and former Democratic Representative Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence in his new administration. Planet America host John Barrett joins me now to unpack it all. John, welcome to the program. Let's start with that meeting at the White House. This is an important tradition, isn't it, in the transition of power, but it didn't happen last time.
Absolutely right, Dan. Good morning. An extraordinary tableau to see the current president, Joe Biden, the former and future president in Donald Trump, meeting by the fireside in the Oval Office, exchanging pleasantries. The very fact that Joe Biden invited Donald Trump so soon is symbolic. It is a recognition of Trump's election victory and the inevitability that he will return to the presidency next January 20th. But it also makes a point, a very strong point, as you allude to, Dan, that Donald Trump refused to accept the result of the 2020 election. He did not invite Joe Biden to the White House for such a pleasant meeting. He did not attend Joe Biden's inauguration on the 20th of January in 2021. Instead, he incited an insurrection and a violent attack on the Capitol building on January 6th to try and stop Joe Biden rightfully, legally, legitimately taking office. So this was an extraordinary moment where Joe Biden is hoping that part of his legacy will be a return to the normalcy of a peaceful transition of power, even if it is by rewarding the perpetrator.
John, can you talk us through what we've seen with the latest announcements of who will be part of Donald Trump's cabinet? But firstly, just what is the tenor of the people that he's picking say about what sort of cabinet and government he wants to lead?
Mixed messages, I think, in short, Dan. The choice of Florida Senator Marco Rubio as America's next top diplomat, the Secretary of State, will be tremendously reassuring to many Republicans, many Americans of all political stripes, whether they agree with Marco Rubio's conservative politics or not. He is seen as a moderate, reasonable, mainline Republican, somebody who is more likely to reflect the foreign policy of the Bush and Romney Republican Party rather than the Trump Republican Party, likely to support NATO and Ukraine against Russian expansionism. So he is seen as a reassuring, a conventional choice. Very different, though, these other significant choices. Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, likely to be hugely controversial, Dan. The Director of National Intelligence has oversight of America's 17 intelligence agencies. Tulsi Gabbard, a former Army veteran, a former Democratic Congresswoman and Democratic presidential candidate in 2020, was accused of being a Russian asset by Hillary Clinton and many others, including former head of the CIA, General Michael Hayden. Tulsi Gabbard has been funded by some of the same people who fund Vladimir Putin. She is at best seen as being a useful idiot to the Kremlin, as is often referred to in intelligence circles, somebody who is an asset without necessarily knowing that they are being manipulated. The very fact that Tulsi Gabbard is to be put in charge of American intelligence has been likened by some analysts to putting the fox in charge of the chicken house. Whether all of those assessments of her are true or not, she has been parroting very pro-Russian messages when it comes to the war in Ukraine. She very controversially met with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, also a key ally of the Russians. So this is a hugely concerning appointment. And then Matt Gaetz, as Attorney General of the United States, not just conventionally unqualified to be the top law officer of the United States, arguably the second or third most important government post under Donald Trump. He is an accused sex offender. He was alleged to have engaged in human trafficking of a 17-year-old. He's the kind of guy who is widely disliked by even his Republican House colleagues. He reportedly would show pictures of pornography on his mobile phone to other members of Congress while sitting on the floor of the House of Representatives. So again, a hugely problematic choice. Whether Gabbard or Gaetz manage to get confirmation through the Senate, or whether there is a manoeuvre such as a recess appointment or an acting appointment, remains to be seen. So in short, Dan, a real mixture. Some reassuring choices and some deeply worrying ones.
Just on that question or that point you make there, John, about confirmation, what do you expect to see there? Because this could be very much an ethical dilemma for many of those members of Congress, even if they are on the Republican side.
Donald Trump, Dan, clearly has a very strong mandate for the second time being elected president of the United States, even though sizable portions of his own Republican Party, less sizable this time, admittedly, but they tried to stop him. Many former members of his last administration tried to stop him being re-elected. His former Chief of Staff, John Kelly, describing him as having fascist tendencies. His former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, describing him as fascist to the core. Other senior members describing him as unfit to return to the presidency. And yet here he is, appointing many similarly controversial figures. So what do the Republicans in the Senate, who have to confirm many of these senior cabinet posts, do about that? Well, so many of them now owe their political careers to Donald Trump. They've been elected not because of their own popularity, but because of Donald Trump's popularity. It's unlikely that we're going to see substantial opposition. Some of Trump's main opponents within the Republican Senate conference, like Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, have retired. They have left. So there are very few guardrails left. And then there are the other manoeuvres that even if he can't get the 51 or 50 votes that he would need, plus the Vice President-elect J.D. Vance's vote to get a confirmation through, he can make recess appointments, and he can also make acting appointments that have all the same powers, but just skirt around the requirement for confirmation. It would be a blow for Trump if he can't get his cabinet appointed. He probably will, but there will be howls of protest, certainly from the Democrat side and from the national security establishment, who are deeply concerned about the way that Matt Gaetz will politicise the Attorney General's Department, the Justice Department of the United States, and how Tulsi Gabbard would handle, as Director of National Intelligence, America's greatest secrets.
Yeah, there's certainly some big questions. Before I let you go, John, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this seemingly storm around Kevin Rudd, because we know that there have been people in the US who have said much harsher and harder things about Donald Trump, and one of them is the preemptive vice president.
Outstanding point, Dan. You're absolutely right. And it just goes to show that you can describe Donald Trump as being America's Hitler, which J.D. Vance did, and a con man, which J.D. Vance did, and still go on to become Vice President of the United States under Donald Trump. You simply have to flatter Donald Trump at the right moment. Whether Kevin Rudd can do that now, whether Kevin Rudd wants to do that now, will be fascinating to see. As things currently stand, of course, it would be an unworkable relationship to have Australia's representative in Washington, D.C. be persona non grata with the incoming Trump administration. So perhaps there will have to be a change. But similarly, it is possible to win Donald Trump over. He responds very well to the most recent round of flattery that he hears. So this is going to be a bit of a diplomatic stretch for Kevin Rudd, and also, I guess, a test of his conscience. Does he want to reappraise Donald Trump now in order to keep his job, or does he want to walk away from that post and have somebody else who has perhaps not been so vociferously on the record criticising the future president to take up that post instead?
Appreciate your analysis there, John Barron from Planet America. Meanwhile, the opposition leader is trying to ramp up pressure on the Prime Minister over Kevin Rudd's position as ambassador in Washington. Mr Rudd continues to face questions over his role because of his former criticisms of Donald Trump. The coalition still isn't demanding he resign, but Peter Dutton says Anthony Albanese's judgment in picking Mr Rudd for the role is questioned there. And joining us now is Stephen Jedgetz, our Foreign Affairs correspondent. Stephen, is the coalition now clearly edging away from Mr Rudd?
Yeah, it seems to be, Dan. Now, to be clear, as you mentioned, the opposition is not at this stage demanding Kevin Rudd resign, but you are now getting a bit of hardening of the language that's coming from the major figures within the coalition. In particular, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, struck a pretty different tone, perhaps, to the one that Simon Birmingham, the Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, struck yesterday at the National Press Club. Now, Simon Birmingham said yesterday that the coalition still hoped that Kevin Rudd could succeed, and he said that he hoped that Donald Trump could extend the same forgiveness to Kevin Rudd that he has to many other former critics, including J.D. Vance, as we heard just there from John Barron. If you flatter Donald Trump at the right moments, it does seem like you can sometimes quite easily win yourself back into his good graces. But Peter Dutton this morning was taking a slightly sharper line, saying that in the end it was Mr Albanese's decision to appoint Kevin Rudd to the position and that he had to take responsibility for that decision. Let's take a listen to what Mr Dutton had to say speaking earlier this morning.
In terms of the comments that Mr Rudd's made, well, I guess the difficulty that the Prime Minister's in at the moment is that if he sacks Kevin Rudd, then what does he do with Penny Wong? And if he sacks Penny Wong, what does he do given he's made his own disparaging remarks about President-elect Trump as well? And I mean, the government's in a difficult position. The Prime Minister's made a number of captain's calls, and they've been at odds with the advice that he's received from his closest advisors and colleagues. And I suppose that's a question about the Prime Minister's judgment.
Stephen, has there been any political response to the news of some of Donald Trump's picks for his cabinet?
No, nothing on the record as yet, Dan, but there is a great deal of anxiety in Canberra about some of the most recent picks that we've seen, particularly Tulsi Gabbard. Now, as we just heard from John Barron earlier, there are deep reservoirs of uncertainty about this decision, and that measure of uncertainty isn't just in Washington, it's in other Western capitals as well. At least it's definitely here in Canberra, and that really does stem from an anxiety about her links to Russia. Now, as John was saying, there is a debate about whether the fact that she's at times reproduced Kremlin talking points shows, as Hillary Clinton once suggested, that she might in fact be an asset for the Russians. Others have suggested that she's just susceptible to their talking points. But the fact that she's now DNI, or at least nominated to be DNI, is going to be a real concern for people in Canberra who are already worried about exactly what Donald Trump might do with Ukraine when he resumes power in January next year. Now, it is worth noting that, of course, these are decisions that have to be subjected to the nomination process, and it's not clear whether that will in fact happen. But the prospect of Tulsi Gabbard ascending to that position is one that's going to cause a lot of unease here in Australia throughout federal government ranks, and it's certainly a sharp contrast to the pick of Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. As you've heard earlier, that's a very reassuring pick for people in Canberra. Even if they disagree with him, there's a feeling that he's someone that can be worked with, that he's someone who is essentially an adult in the room, if you like, with a series of common assumptions. That doesn't apply for some of the picks we've seen this morning.
Meanwhile, Stephen, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has landed in Peru for the APEC meeting. What's expected to be the main focus there?
I think inevitably there'll be a big focus less on exactly what's going to happen at APEC and more on what's going to happen next year when Donald Trump does again assume office. Obviously, there will be some important meetings. Anthony Albanese is going to meet with a host of world leaders. There'll be that meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden on the weekend, only their third since Joe Biden has been in office. And you can expect the president, at least according to the White House, to make all the points that you would expect him to make, whether that's on the South China Sea, on trade, on the need for military-to-military communication and the like. But in the end, the main focus, I think, will probably be amongst many of the other members of APEC about exactly what the implications might be of a Trump presidency, in particular if Donald Trump pushes ahead with his plans for massive tariffs on China, global tariffs on many other countries, and his plan to pull out of the Paris Accord. What does that mean for global warming and global efforts to fight climate change? And what are the possible ramifications of a trade war that could be sparked by his tariff plan? There are vast reservoirs of uncertainty here, and I think that all leaders will probably be grappling with that, even if Mr. Trump, of course, isn't at the meeting.
Stephen Jedget's reporting from Canberra.